This program was recorded on Monday, July 8, 2013 on the main campus of Georgetown University, Washington, D.C.
Historians of women's lives and gender believe that looking at traditional history through that lens of women's lives and gender will change the way we view history. And that's certainly true when you examine the role of women in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Now, if you had a chance to read that article by Jan Lewis, the one I sent along, it was called Of Every Age, Sex, and Condition, the Representation of Women in the Constitution, you know that Dr. Lewis advances a very interesting argument. And for those of you who haven't read it yet and have gone out to, what was the name of that bar? The Tombs? Yes, right, the Tombs. If your Tombs attendance has been high, I'm going to recap for you. And this is what Dr. Lewis says. She says, the women and women's legal issues are not directly addressed in the Constitution. Lewis asserts that women are represented in the Constitution thanks to James Wilson, one of the most original and far-seeing thinkers of his day. By combining Lockean thought with the views of the Scottish Enlightenment, Wilson imagined the United States as an expansive, modern, liberal government and nation, and because of that, women had a part to play. And this is how Jan Lewis put it. She said, if the purpose of government and society was not property, but the improvement of the human mind and the protection of other personal rights, then surely women must be included. So, now, having selected that article for your packets and having provided a recap, let me tell you that I disagree with Dr. Lewis. It is true that the language of the Constitution is surprisingly gender neutral. The framers used words like persons, inhabitants, citizens, employing male pronouns to refer only to office holders. It is also true that women, along with children, were counted in apportioning quotas. Nevertheless, in contrast to Dr. Lewis, I argue that women are not part of the Constitution. And that omission, while perhaps not totally conscious, was in its way deliberate, resting upon assumptions about whether women could be, in fact, citizens or even persons. Now, I have to say, Dr. Lewis addresses my kind of issues here, and she says that there's a distinction, quite correctly she says, there's a distinction between civil society, that phrase, which could include a larger community, and some sort of community of those that voted, which certainly wasn't a privilege that even most white men enjoyed at the time of the Constitution. So that's how she kind of gets around that. But my point is less about whether or not women could vote, and more about the construction of them as citizens, or the non-construction. Now, at this point, as I've launched into this, and I've now made my assertion, women are not part of the Constitution, you might be thinking, why are we here? Why are we talking about them? I think the Tombs opens early, we could go there. But I would refer you, before we take off, to my title, Ghosts in the Machinery, which is a reference to a 19th century comment about the problem of women in politics together. A learned gentleman said, it would be no more deplorable to see an angel harnessed to a machine than to see a woman voting politically. And I have to say that Angels in the Machinery is also the title of quite a fine book about political women in the 19th century by Rebecca Edwards. But I appropriated the machinery in my title, of course, is the noiseless machine James Madison intended the Constitution, and indeed the whole structure of government, to be. But as there seem to be always gremlins in our most expensive cars and computers, our machine of government is haunted by the exclusion of women. In addition, as we stand here today, this discussion of women and politics is part of a large body of thought that began with Aristotle and continues through today whenever people formulate social and political theories. Women have always been a problem in the polity. Not the women themselves necessarily, but what to do with them, how to categorize them. While women are obviously adults, they are almost always never characterized with adult males in political theories and systems. Rather, because they are framed not as women but as wives, they get categorized with other dependents, such as children, slaves, and the insane. Now, let me take a famous example, Locke's famous state of nature argument, which theorizes that every individual human was born with inherent, one might say inalienable, rights. And it's an elegant formulation, especially the part where these human agents, and that was one of Locke's words, agents, each agree to sacrifice part of their individual autonomy in order to live in the peaceful and harmonious social groups that humans, or agents, as he called them, crave. And when I explain this to students, I often use speed limits. That is, we all give up part of our personal right to go as fast as we can on the roadways to obey the speed limit so that we all may travel safely. It's a great example, but then I moved to California and it went, whatever. And of course, these social groups that Locke talks about, he has that very famous quote, "Man is a social animal." And for a while, we'd say he meant man as in men and women, but then perhaps not. Because when it came to women, Locke couldn't afford them the same rights of choice and autonomy as those he called individuals. For Locke, as for many, women were wives, and their loyalty could not be to any state first, but to their husbands. And here's the way Locke tried to reconcile his theory with the reality of female humans. So the Lockean big idea, as you know, that appealed to the American revolutionaries was the idea of the social contract, that men chose to give up some power to be well and properly ruled, but since the power came from them, as opposed to God, they had the right to nullify the contract, to take the power back if, say, a British monarch reneged on his part of the deal. In Locke's theory, men chose every day to be ruled until the day they were not ruled well. Then they had not just the right, but the responsibility to rebel. And you can see why that was very attractive to the revolutionaries. But Locke couldn't see how he could give women that kind of choice. He was certainly not going to allow women to end the civil contract of marriage if their husbands proved as tyrannical as an absolute monarch. So this is how he did it. He did give women choice once, at one moment of their lives, when they agreed to marry a certain person. And after that, their choice was implied. So what are we going to do about the problem of women in the polity, or what we might call female trouble? And the answer is that even when a document, a moment, an event, such as the framing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, or the process of ratification, is silent on the issue of women, we must question that silence. In the last 20 years ago, we've become very aware of the meanings of historical silence around the issue of slavery and race. Silence is never neutral. And when we listen to the ghosts in the constitutional machinery, we see they have much to tell us about citizenship, how Americans get it, exercise it, and lose it. The partial presence of women in the Constitution means that a very different idea of citizenship is present in this founding document. So for the most part, we get the idea of citizenship in the Constitution, the white male citizenship, that's the obvious model. We also understand the state of the stateless. The language about enslaved people in the Constitution reminds us of what it's like to be a person with no rights. But married white women present a different model, one more akin to slavery than citizenship, or if it is citizenship, it's covered, partial, contingent. And that's why I wrote my one word on the board, which I'll even just step back so the folks can see it. It's coverture. At the time of the American Revolution, American women, along with their English counterparts, were legally bound under the institution of coverture. Coverture held that no female person had a legal identity. At birth, a female baby was covered by her father's identity, and then when she was married, by her husband. The husband and wife became one, and that one was the husband. As a symbol of the subsuming of identity, women took the last names of their husbands. Because they could not legally exist, married women could not make contracts or be sued. They could not own or work in businesses. Married women owned nothing, not even the clothes on their backs. They had no rights to their children, so if a wife divorced or left her husband or he left her, she would never see her children again. Married women legally had no rights to their bodies. That meant not only would a husband have a claim to any wages generated by his wife's labor, or what they called the fruits of her body, her children, but he also had an absolute right to sexual access. Within marriage, a woman's consent was implied. So under the law, all sex-related activity, including rape, was legitimate. His total mastery of this human being stopped short, but just short, of death. Of course, a man was not allowed to beat his wife to death, but he could beat her. Now, the law doesn't always reflect real life, and in truth, equity practices ensured that coverture on the ground was less restrictive than the black letter law indicated. And though a woman could own nothing, men who wanted to pass on their wealth through their daughters to their grandchildren devised legal ways to keep money and property out of the hands of sons-in-laws. And the demands of commerce played their part in mitigating this coverture on the ground. Though a woman could not make a contract, plenty of women did business and trade, either on their own in a legal exception called femme sole, a single woman, or for absent husbands. Wives often ran businesses alongside their mates, with the local community acting as monitors and enforcers. So yes, I suppose technically a woman couldn't make a contract, but in a small town she would only do that once, right? Renege on a contract. And we also must assume that though husbands had the right to marital relations at will, that there was a great deal of negotiation around sex. Coverture was what Abigail Adams was talking about in her famous Remember the Ladies letter to John. She referenced that long-standing nature of coverture when she bade him, quote, to be more generous and favorable to them, the present-day ladies, than your ancestors. Abigail Adams understood the corruption of absolute power as clearly as any revolutionary theorist. She said, do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Abigail even obliquely referred to the shame of marital rape and physical abuse when she supposed, why not then put it out of the power of the vicious and lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor these customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. And actually the clue here is the word vicious, which just means just very bad, but that had a kind of sort of sexual violent connotation. Now, I think that we, and by we I mean scholars, teachers, and educated Americans alike, have not come to terms with the idea that our founding happened with coverture in place, and that we never abolished it. Coverture is the ghost in our machine. And I think, and this is the reason I like to talk to teachers, I think it should be part of the lexicon, along with ideas such as republicanism and liberty. Marriage under coverture was an oppressive system. We have a hard time understanding its scope and depth. You know, one of the great discussions in American history is how colonial America instituted slavery so quickly, and how it became so all-encompassing, again, fairly quickly. Because after all, by the 1690s, 1700s say, colonial America had one of the most total systems of slavery in the world. It was lifelong, immutable, and inheritable. And there are many theories about how this happened, but the study of gendered systems such as marriage can supply one important factor. That is, it was easy for colonial men to construct a system of almost total control over African bodies because they had such a system in place already. It was marriage, and it proved a highly workable model for chattel slavery, even supplying slavery with a justification based in nature. And if you know about the history of slavery, not all slaveries were based in nature. It was a temporary condition. But in the same way, marriage used the natural inferiority of women to rationalize female subordination, and slavery, at least the American version, would develop a race-based biology that concretized its own system of slavery. And indeed, before the abolition of slavery, the secondary citizen status of white married women was used as a reference point to allow lawmakers to justify not allowing free blacks the full benefit of citizenship. So before slaves are abolished, that they use that reference point of white women's degraded status. Later, of course, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would remedy that inequity, at least for black women, but women remain behind, black, white, all races, as partial citizens. So that was the system. The Revolution didn't change it at all, nor did the Constitution. Though new rights for men meant some new rights for women. Just by extension, thanks to the Bill of Rights, women partook in many of the rights that men enjoyed. Law protected the property of widows and single women. With their husband's permission, married women could assemble freely, practice their religion, exercise free speech. They also had the right to petition and the right to trial by jury, though the jury of their peers would be made up of men. Enslaved people enjoyed none of these second-hand rights. Women had legal rights in extremis, so a wife could divorce her husband or swear out a warrant against him if he committed a crime against her, which of course slaves couldn't do that. They couldn't divorce their masters. And the law provided enslaved people with no refuge against excessive physical force. But when it came to their rights specifically as women, wives, legally the only difference between a slave and a married woman was that a husband could not sell his wife, nor could he prostitute her out. And even those distinctions were shaky. Some of the first persons sold in North America were white women from England sold to Virginia colonists as wives. And when you look at this comparison of the legal status of enslaved people and white wives, I like to think of it less as a face-to-face and more of a side-by-side assessment. The status of both of these groups of citizens or people, inhabitants, overlapped. There was no legal treatment for enslaved people that at some times in place did not apply to wives. And another way to understand this dynamic between slavery and marriage is if you think that colonial and early national marriage was not as oppressive as the most extreme form of slavery in the world, United States slavery, it certainly was as coercive as less intense slaveries in other parts of the world. In an era that spoke of issues of autonomy and how a group of men, Parliament, had no right to virtually represent another group of men, American colonists, it seemed shocking that there was no change, however small, in the legal status of women. Now, I want to go back to this idea that women enjoyed ancillary rights under the new system. I said, like men, they could assemble freely, petition, and speak freely, but only in the case of married women if their husbands let them. And I guess what we could call what married women had second-class citizenship. But really, the contrast in liberties for men and those for women was so great, it was more a case of steerage citizenship. Now, this state of affairs, once we understand coverture and we understand this model of citizenship in the Constitution, it alerts us to a secret struggle or tension within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Now, you're used to hearing that word tension. The most overt source of tension, of course, is between federal power and states' rights. But our ghostly women point to another, the struggle between public policy and private life. Grounded in ancient principles of British jurisprudence, American law has always supposed a private family realm where a man is the king of his castle and the tenets of law don't apply or don't apply in the same way. Now, this is a contradiction in modern society. Are people truly equal under the law, treated the same way regardless of status, condition, or context? Or are some ruled over by a private patriarch who is possessed of special powers, powers that are sometimes at odds with the mission of the state and yet are also protected by the state? Many times the state will not violate the primacy of the family in order to afford citizens the kind of protection they would have on the street. And this trend has been changing for many of us in our lifetimes, the 1970s. So thanks to the work of feminists, domestic issues such as spousal violence, marital rape, the abuse of children are no longer hidden behind the door of the family home. We Americans began to question why a man could not attack a woman in the streets without being charged, but if he were married to her, he could act with impunity. By not eliminating or mitigating coverture and giving women the rights of individuals, The U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights retained that ancient rule of law that a man ruled his home as a ruler would a nation, and that is still an unresolved tension. So if we go back to the comparison of that more famous constitutional tension, we should continue to struggle over issues of federal power versus states' rights on a case-by-case basis. That is how the system is supposed to work. Indeed, it's the hallmark and strength of our governance. But on this tension that I'm talking about between private life and public policy, this covered citizenship, this is one we have to decide once and for all. And I have to say, as we're thinking a lot about same-sex marriage these days, those discussions have brought the question of what is marriage to the fore. What are the special privileges of marriage, and do we want to keep them? This conversation about whether we want to extend the right of marriage to everyone gives us the chance to house clean, as it were. For instance, are we going to retain such outmoded notions as name changing, or spousal immunity, where one spouse cannot testify against the other, even if he or she wants to, even at the cost of letting the guilty go? Spousal immunity came directly from coverture, where a wife could not testify against her husband because she was him. It was, you cannot incriminate yourself, well, you can have your wife testify, because her testimony would be a form of self-incrimination. But enough of the 21st century, though I hope we can return to it in the questions and answers. Let's get back to the late 18th century, where the framers were less concerned with this contradiction of public and private, and much more obsessed with another issue. That's what you have to do in history. Go back and see what they were obsessed with. And this was an issue that they thought was vital to the national experiment. Historian Joseph Ellis frames this as a viability of the nation. I call it legitimacy, but it's the same thing. And this is what it was, in short. No one, former colonist or European observer, was certain that the Republican experiment was going to last, that the United States would last, that the Union would hold. No one was sure of that. It was precisely this uncertainty that led men such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton to create the Constitution, to consolidate and shore up power. This need for legitimacy, to prove to themselves and others that the U.S. was a real political enterprise, gave rise to much anxiety and fear. And I think it is this anxiety of viability that prevented the framers from addressing the glaring contradiction of this category of degraded citizenship in their shiny new machine of government. Make no mistake, they could have done many things to have brought women into the political fold, but they chose not to. Anxiety and more historical silence. Now, in the past, we feminist historians have let the founders off the hook around the issue of women's full citizenship. We used to say they just, didn't know any better. They couldn't imagine other options. Or how historian Linda Kerber put it, there was a vacuum when it came to the subjects, one that historians took literally, concluding that there was silence in the Revolutionary era because there was nothing to say. And this is what Kerber said in the 1980s. She said the limited definition of female citizenship, which she called Republican motherhood, was all that the revolutionary discourse would permit, and that it is generally thought to be both unfair and ahistorical to expect of the revolutionary generation that it initiate a radically new conception of female citizenship. But of course, that's what we used to say around the issue of the founders and slavery. And just as our new research on race and slavery has complicated our sweeping assumption that they just didn't know, we now understand that there was a moment when the framers could have allowed what? Women of property to vote? Could have let married women retain property? Could have modified divorce laws? Or could have set aside the rule of coverture and start over from scratch? And it took us a while to see it. Oh, sure, there were little indications that people were thinking about the woman problem, as they called it. We have James Otis, one of the most brilliant political theorists and the brother of Mercy Otis Warren. In 1764, he makes a speech and he says, "If all were reduced to a state of nature," reference to Locke, "had not apple women, women who sell apples, and orange girls, as good a right to give their respectable suffrages for a new king as does the philosopher, courtier, and politician." Were these and 10 millions of these not consulted? He even said, are not women born as free as men? But after this, shortly, he was consigned to an insane asylum. So these sentiments were dismissed as, well, obviously he was crazy. Did you hear that speech about the apple women? Right. But it turns out always with silence, as you start poking at it, it's not really a vacuum at all. When it came to examining the nature of women and their role in a republic based on equality, this is an uncomfortable silence with odd outbursts and all the tension that marks the difference between simply not seeing and ignoring. And one of these silent moments where the silence gets burst is right after the revolution, as the state courts, the new states of these United States, began to deal with the problem of loyalist properties, right? The properties, houses, grounds of loyalists. So there's a rule, it's really simple actually. If a loyalist man leaves his home and lands in the colonies and fled back to England, his property could be seized by the state as punishment for treason. And obviously not only the man is deprived of the property, but his heirs as well. That's the rule. But what if, as in several prominent cases, the property in question came to the man, the fleeing man, through his wife? That is, his wife's father had entailed land and property to pass through his daughter to her children, circumventing the husband. And so in the cases that came before court, yes, it was argued that the wives had fled the country along with their husbands, but could that be interpreted as a political statement, a political action on par with a man's desertion? After all, lawyers for the plaintiffs argued, a good wife obeyed her husband and followed him. Such a woman, she could have been a patriot at heart, but her political affiliation or allegiance mattered not, as women had little or no legal or political existence. They argued a woman's primary responsibility and allegiance was to her husband, not the state. That's the heart of coverture. So you see, the heirs that wanted the property that would have come to them through their mothers were arguing that, hey, yes, my mother deserted, but it didn't mean anything. It should still come to me. States who wanted to keep that property confiscated found themselves in the novel position of arguing that women could be citizens with a responsibility to the state that they were in fact capable of treason. In Martin versus Massachusetts, the counsel for the state argued that when Anna Martin, mother of the plaintiff James Martin, chose to accompany her husband back to England, that she acted in a political capacity, thus abandoning her Massachusetts property. Now, there's a little handful of cases across the new states, and they're decided in a variety of ways. So in Martin's case, he got his mother's property, which is undoubtedly what she would have wanted, but he was able to do so because the justices who decided his case proceeded from a conservative point of view. They decided that married women were not autonomous actors apart from their husbands. But, as I said, other cases went another way. The point of all of this is not to sort of tot up which cases went this way, but to know that there are moments like this that demonstrate that the failure to ameliorate the degraded status of women was not inevitable or unimaginable. These men who are constructing the new nation, case by case, law by law, could have imagined new ideas of female citizenship. And sometimes, of course, the best proof is negative, and I'm talking about the proof of the revolutionary moment and the anxiety it engendered, in that there was a backlash against women after the Revolutionary War. And I'm going to plug a book here. It is not mine. It is by Rosemary Zagarri, and for those who are writing, it's Zagarri. She's an old friend of our group. She's from George Mason, and she is the author of a book called Revolutionary Backlash. And what she says is that after the American Revolution, there's an increasing politicization of white women. Women are inventing and exploiting political capacities, and they're doing it in the 1780s, 90s, into the first decades of the 1800s. Women even are voting in New Jersey in the 1800s. What happens is then, with the growth of the two-party system and the increasingly bitter partisanship in the early 1800s, women suffered a backlash and were forced out of the public sphere and out of a politics that was increasingly about the vote. Now, I'm postulating to you that this anxiety over legitimacy made the framers and founding men sensitive to anything that would seem to diminish or challenge their authority. In an age that equated masculinity with authority, that made anything that made them feel or seem less than men. ceding the power over wives that coverture gave them would be such an act not only for them, but in the eyes of the world. You could see, in fact, this time in American history as a crisis of masculinity, with masculinity equaling authority and viability. And the last thing the male revolutionaries would do would be to call their masculine authority into question by freeing their wives. Now, to take a title of a recent book, this certainly could be seen as a profound, quote, failure of the founders. But rather, we share in that failure. Rather than being abolished by a constitutional amendment, we've chipped away at coverture, and we've never gotten rid of it completely. So we get native-born American women who lose their citizenship when they marry foreigners, as late as the 1950s. In many places, women were not permitted to serve on juries until the mid-20th century, thus encroaching on one of the fundamental constitutional rights. Marital rape wasn't recognized, let alone disavowed, until the 1970s. And the idea behind coverture is that all women are wives, which put single women in odd kinds of positions. I do collect coverture in modern life stories, and one of my favorite was a single woman who had a good job, made money, and she couldn't get a bank loan. She couldn't buy a house. And the funny thing, of course, is she was a bank officer, and her own bank would give her a house. And really, if you're a man, you've ever tried to change your name to your wife's name, or if you've bought property as a married woman, especially in the Northeast, you've run into coverture. And most of the time, these vestiges of coverture are just annoying or even funny, but the question remains, why don't we just get rid of it? American law chipped away at coverture as needed because there was a real reluctance simply to declare women to be equal under the law by constitutional amendment. The usefulness of such an amendment, of course, is clear when it was time to remedy race-based discrimination. We cranked out not one but 3 amendments. And I think we as a citizenry need to understand this reluctance to abolish coverture, since we moderns haven't been able to grant equal rights to women in the same way that they should have abolished coverture by constitutional amendment. And that's why I study the founders and their fears around the issue of female equality and their decision to do nothing to alleviate the degraded status of half the population. And I do so not to judge them, not to point out their limitations, but to understand ours. Thank you so much.